This is a rare scene of cold weapon warfare in the history of cinema. It recounts a real battle from Scottish history, led by Robert I. 500 irregular soldiers defeated 3,000 heavily armored English knights, defying the odds. This marked a pivotal chapter in Scotland's struggle for independence. The film has been praised by many netizens as a sequel to Braveheart. However, compared to its predecessor, the movie is closer to the true historical events. It depicts the tumultuous uprising of Robert I. Unlike William Wallace, he did not shout for freedom, nor did he have overly idealistic lofty ambitions. He was simply a nobleman who knew how to read the times. A wise and patient leader, he was a formidable figure. The story is set in 1304. At that time, Scotland suffered a tragic blow. King Alexander suddenly passed away. He died without an heir to the throne. A group of Scottish lords invited Edward I of England to come to Scotland as an arbitrator to select a successor. This act of inviting a wolf into the house led to Edward claiming Scotland as his own. He then imposed his oppressive regime to amass wealth. Under this tyranny, the Scots rose up to resist, led by William Wallace. But unfortunately, they suffered a crushing defeat. Afterward, many Scottish nobles surrendered. Edward also captured the last castle in Scotland. During the surrender ceremony, Edward accepted the oaths of loyalty from the nobles. After the ceremony, he called Robert and John before him. These two were the most qualified nobles to inherit the throne. However, Edward did not hand the throne to either of them. To avoid appearing biased, he appointed his confidant, Valence, as the governor of Scotland. In reality, Valence was just a puppet for Edward to continue ruling Scotland. He ordered Robert and John to obey Valence's leadership. He even urged them to put aside their grievances and reconcile. After the ceremony, a down-and-out lord named Douglas petitioned Edward. His father had followed Wallace in the uprising, was captured after defeat, and died a tragic death in an English prison. Now, he hoped Edward would return his family's land to him, but he was ruthlessly rejected and thrown out. This man would later become Robert's first fierce general. Edward then gathered everyone outside to showcase his siege weapon. Stirling Castle was the last stronghold of Scotland's defenses. The castle's lord had surrendered 2 days earlier, but Edward did not accept the surrender, intending to use the new weapon to intimidate the nobles. As the soldiers ignited the projectiles in the trebuchet, he cut the rope that held the mechanism. The massive projectile flew toward the distant castle, incinerating the last bit of Scottish resistance. Afterward, he casually walked up to Robert and praised his wise choice to submit to him. Robert remained silent. He was supposed to be crowned the King of Scotland and was naturally unwilling to be a pawn on someone else's chessboard. On the way out, his father told Robert that he believed Edward would allow him to sit on the Scottish throne once the situation stabilized. This was also why he advised his son not to continue resisting. After his death, the throne would naturally become his. Robert disagreed with his father's views, but out of filial piety, he had no choice but to comply. At this time, the defeated Scots were suffering under Edward's increasingly harsh taxes, making life extremely difficult for the people. To make up for the losses from suppressing the rebellion, Edward also forcibly conscripted soldiers from Scotland. This left the lower-class citizens, who thought submission would mean no more fighting, quite dissatisfied. The English soldiers coming to conscript even spared no one, not even underage children. When Robert was at a loss, Elizabeth, his politically arranged wife, stepped forward. She was part of Edward's strategy to control Scotland. However, witnessing this scene, she soon became a supporter of Robert. Not long after, Robert's father fell gravely ill and, on his deathbed, confessed to his son that Edward was no longer a friend worthy of admiration. Constantly compromising with him would only plunge the Scots deeper into misery. He seemed to have made a wrong decision, and after saying this, he passed away. His father's final words further solidified Robert's desire for Scottish independence. After the funeral, when he went to the border to pay the taxes he had collected, he realized that he was not the only one wanting independence. In the border town of Berwick, a pair of English cavalry appeared in the square, pulling a cart. This instantly silenced the once bustling town. As Robert emerged after paying the taxes, he saw the crowd gathering in the square. He approached and discovered that Wallace had been executed by the English in a gruesome manner, his body dismembered and sent to various towns for display. Part of it had been sent here. The brutal fate of their national hero ignited the people's anger. They gathered together to protest against the soldiers, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The chaos before him made Robert realize that he was not the only one who had not given up on resistance. The flame of rebellion deep within him was reignited. He immediately returned home and declared his plan to fight against the English to his brothers. The brothers, who had previously only been able to endure, immediately agreed. To strengthen the uprising, he went to the church to meet his old rival John. He hoped John would join him in fighting against the English for the sake of their nation's independence. But John believed they had already failed once, and the people needed to recuperate after the war. He did not agree to join and intended to report this news to Edward. As long as Robert was executed for rebellion, the throne would naturally become John's. Threatened, Robert instinctively killed him, but after realizing what he had done, he knew he had committed a grave mistake. The 13th century was the height of the church's power in Europe. Even with Robert's desire to restore his country, killing someone in a church left him in a panic. He went to the church to confess his crime. After discussion, the bishops decided not only to absolve him but also to support his coronation as king. The condition was that Robert had to swear loyalty to the church. While political power and religious authority often fluctuated, these elders were still quite reasonable in the grand scheme of things. However, killing an opponent in a holy place led the nobles to have differing opinions about his impending kingship. Receiving only partial support laid the groundwork for future struggles and hardships. On the way to his coronation, Robert encountered Douglas, who was alone. He knelt on one knee, hoping to pledge loyalty to Robert. His goal was to defeat the English and reclaim his family's lands. Robert gladly agreed. In 1306, Robert was crowned king on the Stone of Scone, known as Robert I.
I wear this crown as a symbol of my duty to serve the Scottish people.
This news quickly reached the English, and Edward was furious. He issued a decree declaring Robert an outlaw, stating that anyone who encountered him could kill him without trial. At the pleading of the prince, he sent his inept son to lead the cavalry to Scotland to suppress the rebellion. After Robert's coronation, before the English army could reach Scotland, he first encountered Valence, whom Edward viewed as a puppet. John, who had been killed by Robert, was Valence's brother-in-law, and at this moment, he was publicly and privately opposed to Robert. He was eager to engage in battle and eliminate this outlaw king. Robert sensed his hostility, but at that time, his army needed to conserve strength and prepare for a major battle with the English, so he proposed a duel with Valence, who readily agreed. However, today happened to be a day of religious observance, and according to tradition, no fighting could occur, so they decided to postpone the duel until tomorrow. That night, Robert and his men set up camp, but during the night, Valence suddenly launched a surprise attack on them. Arrows flew through the sky, and the camp was engulfed in flames, causing chaos. Robert struggled to defend himself and his wife and daughter with a shield, but this was only the first wave of Valence's attack. Although Douglas and other commanders fought valiantly, the unorganized forces were no match for Valence. In a moment of desperation, Robert entrusted his wife and daughter to his brother, sending them to seek refuge with a trustworthy lord. He then drew his sword, cutting down a cavalryman and preparing to break through the encirclement. But after just a few steps, his horse was brought down by a spear, and he found himself in a desperate battle. Despite the bravery of the uprising's leaders, they suffered heavy casualties against overwhelming odds. Seeing the situation deteriorate, Commander Angus pulled the bloodied Robert back, leading a few elite soldiers to flee in haste. The next day, Valence, amidst a field of corpses, could not find Robert and was somewhat exasperated. He had acted rashly, not waiting for the English army led by the prince to arrive, and would be held accountable for it. Meanwhile, the escaped Robert was left with only 50 soldiers following him. He heeded Angus's suggestion to head to his hometown, the Isle of Islay. After settling there, he planned to recruit more soldiers. However, on the way, they encountered the noble MacDougall, who blocked their path. Seeing that his opponent was not attacking, Robert stepped forward and tried to convince him to join his forces. But this man was John's cousin and was very angry about Robert killing his cousin in the church. Therefore, he could not join but admired Robert's courage to rise up against the English, and in his conflicted state, he allowed them to pass. A few days later, the group finally reached the opposite side of the Isle of Islay. They released the horses and planned to cross the river in small groups using the two small boats at the ferry. Robert took the first boat across, while Douglas and his brothers waited behind. What they did not know was that the English army, led by the prince, had already entered Scotland, burning and pillaging everywhere. They threatened the Scots to hand over Robert's head. The MacDougall, who had previously let them pass, was also on his way. As Robert reached the shore and watched Angus go back to pick up the others, he noticed his pursuers coming out of the woods. He quickly rushed into the river, shouting a warning.
Angus! Look! MacDougall!
But even so, the people waiting in place could not avoid this brutal battle. As Douglas and the others fought desperately, Robert hurriedly paddled a small boat back. Angus, who had previously rowed across, also returned to the shore. The group realized they were outmatched and began to fight while retreating. Just as Robert was about to reach the shore, he saw his own brother pierced through the chest by a spear, filling him with grief and rage. But the fighting did not stop. It was only when Douglas seized the opportunity to slit the throat of the leading MacDougall that the pursuing soldiers finally halted. The surviving rebels quickly boarded the small boat, and Robert once again made a hasty escape. They finally arrived at the Isle of Islay and found the local lord, Mackinnon. This man had fought alongside William Wallace during the last uprising. However, Robert had not sent troops to support him due to his father's situation, leaving Mackinnon resentful and unwilling to help them. But seeing the determined Robert, he did not make things difficult for him. Robert believed that after some time, Mackinnon would change his mind, and then he turned to leave. Ultimately, the group returned to the small village where Angus was born, where they could rest and recuperate. The English prince, unable to capture Robert, decided to target his family after gathering information. He led his troops to the castle where Elizabeth was hiding and stormed in, capturing her. He then interrogated Robert's brother Neil, trying to find out Robert's whereabouts, but received no answers. In truth, they were unaware of Robert's plans, as he had only decided on them after they had separated. The lack of results from the interrogation infuriated the prince. He hanged Neil and disemboweled him, while the old Lord Ferrisser was ruthlessly slain. As for Elizabeth and Robert's daughter, they were sent to a prison in England. After some time, news reached the Isle of Islay that Robert's brother had been brutally killed and his wife and daughter captured. Robert could no longer sit idly by. He immediately decided to leave. At this moment, with national and familial grievances weighing heavily on him, he could no longer tolerate the situation. With a small number of troops, he decided to engage in guerrilla warfare. Using whatever underhanded tactics necessary, he quietly returned to his occupied castle, finding familiar woodsmen and Douglas among others. They hid in his cart. Once inside the walls, they waited for the right moment to sneak out and coordinate with those waiting outside. They opened the city gates and caught the English soldiers stationed there off guard. To leave the English with no stronghold, he ruthlessly set fire to his own castle. Afterward, Angus followed suit, disguising himself and his men to infiltrate the church in his former territory. While the enemy was distracted listening to the priest's sermon, he drew his dagger and began to slaughter. Through this series of battles, he gradually developed his own frenzied fighting style, enjoying shouting his name while killing. Although Robert's ruthless tactics did not align with the prevailing chivalric ideals of the time, they left the English army in disarray. Moreover, by capturing one stronghold after another, the size of the rebel forces gradually expanded. News of the resistance reached England. Edward was very disappointed in his son, given Robert's rising reputation in Scotland. He decided to personally lead an army to suppress Robert and extinguish this flame of rebellion. Thus, in 1307, Edward I set out with his troops. However, at this point, he was elderly, nearing 70, and his body could not withstand the grueling march. He fell ill along the way and died. Afterward, Edward II became the commander of the English forces. Unlike the previous pursuit of Robert with a small force, this time he commanded a full 3,000 elite knights. His goal was to crush Scotland. Robert knew he could not avoid confrontation and understood that Scotland's army was no match for the English in terms of numbers or equipment. He decided to use the land that the English sought to conquer but did not understand. If he could lure the English army into the marshes, the heavily armored cavalry would become mired in the mud. Then, his lightly equipped infantry could exploit their agility to fight back. He led over 500 soldiers, many of whom were poorly equipped, to begin constructing defensive fortifications. Once prepared, he had Douglas wear his gloves and provoke the Prince and Valence on the English advance route. He challenged them to a decisive battle on Loudon Hill the next day. This time, they would confront the enemy head-on, no longer hiding. Edward II didn't give them a second thought. He was confident, believing that with 3,000 knights, a single charge would annihilate the enemy in an instant. However, Robert was not entirely confident about the upcoming battle. He instructed his men to hold the constructed defenses and force the English to split their forces, surrounding them from the marshes on both sides. The rest was left to fate. Just as he finished outlining this strategy, Lord Mackinnon from Islay came to pledge his allegiance. Although he had only about 40 men, this was like a timely gift for Robert. In response to Mackinnon's apology for not helping earlier, Robert bore no grudges and expressed his gratitude. It seemed he had anticipated this outcome. The next morning, Robert donned his old, light armor and walked through the ragtag army. Behind him flew a tattered and worn military flag, but his gaze was resolute as he led his soldiers to the constructed fortifications. Opposite them, the fully armored English cavalry advanced like a steel wall. Leading the charge were Edward II and Valence, well armed and accompanied by the sound of drums, exuding an overwhelming presence. This stood in stark contrast to the shabby rebels. Edward mounted his horse and began a pre-battle rally, loudly accusing Robert of being a murderer who killed in a holy place. He slandered that Robert's next target was to invade England, declaring that he must capture him today, which drew cheers from the soldiers. Robert, however, had no grandiose rhetoric. He sincerely hoped everyone would fight bravely for their own cause. The oppressed people no longer needed encouragement. Their fiery spirit matched that of the 3,000 knights across from them. With Valence's command, the cavalry began their charge. Robert and his men stood ready at the front lines. They formed a line, hiding the traps behind them. As the cavalry approached, he commanded his soldiers to retreat behind the trenches, raising their pikes to avoid the enemy's high leaps. The cavalry, realizing too late, could not slow down and fell into the traps in a rush. Although Valence discovered the traps, the cavalry had already slowed down and found themselves surrounded. They were now within range of the archers. Mounted on immobile warhorses, they became living targets, pulled down and killed by the rebels. Douglas and the other commanders held their ground, and Valence realized he could not contend with them in front of the trenches, deciding to flank them. Edward II was furious, and the cavalry, just as Robert had predicted, became mired in the marshes, unable to continue their charge. The heavy armor slowed their movements, and they were overwhelmed by the infantry. In a blood frenzy on the battlefield, Douglas spotted the enemy who had once defeated his father. This enemy had also insulted their family name, and now, filled with rage, he finally found him. All the rebels, like Douglas, were filled with murderous intent. Valence, fully armed, was cautious on his horse, while the clueless Edward II rushed in with his troops. As he approached, he realized the area was filled with marshes and traps, but he remained confident. The morale of the rebels soared, and even the still weak youths repeatedly killed enemies. Finally, Valence realized the situation was dire and shouted for a retreat. With that command, the already demoralized English cavalry dropped their helmets and armor, fleeing from this hellish place. They left the prince behind in the enemy's lines. Robert saw him, and the two began their fateful duel. The arrogant Edward II was no match for Robert, and he was quickly knocked to the ground. Robert contemptuously dropped his weapon, watching the English king struggle in the mud. When Edward attempted to rise, Robert delivered a punch that shattered his fighting spirit. However, he did not kill him, as keeping this inept king alive would be more beneficial for Scotland. Moreover, sending him back to his camp in disgrace would be the greatest humiliation. Amidst the victorious cheers, Robert won this miraculous battle. This marked an important turning point in Scotland's resistance. Compared to Braveheart, Outlaw King has fewer dramatic adaptations. The plot is relatively serious and subdued, but the details are meticulously crafted, with grand and atmospheric cinematography. It is indeed a rare war epic.